Everything that lives is designed to end. They are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. However, life is all about the struggle within this cycle. That is what we believe.
Death is arguably the most paradoxical element of our existence. It's constantly talked about yet often skirted around in serious conversations. It's a topic that stirs anxiety about the future, fuels existential crises that aren't just one-off episodes, but recurring themes throughout our life. And yes, even occupies our thoughts during solitary moments, like when you're in the bathroom, right before you go to sleep, or even when you're showering. Death's abstractness makes it weird, confusing, and let's be brutally honest here, it's incredibly scary. This overwhelming nature tends to make us quite literally suppress thoughts of it. Despite the hesitancy to dwell on the subject, it's an undeniable aspect of life, interwoven with the fabric of our daily existence, from school and relationship to our life goals, culture, religious or spiritual affiliations, hobbies, and work. But here's the thing, discussing death always brings us to a pretty awkward crossroads. How do we make sense of a topic with seemingly endless interpretations, or conversely, a singular, unavoidable truth? The wealth of media, art, literature, philosophical discourse, and religious beliefs about death has done little to diminish its aura of uncertainty and fear. Within this video, I want to slightly pivot away from the often introspective focus on our own mortality to explore how encountering the deaths of others can profoundly shape us, and in return, help us confront our own mortality. It's a perspective I believe offers invaluable lessons which I don't hear about usually. So what exactly is death? Is it simply the end of life as we know it, a gateway to something new, or perhaps something more complex? One thing is for certain, dying is an unavoidable part of existence. The biological perspective on death is straightforward, defining it as the irreversible halt of all vital functions such as the heartbeat, breathing, and brain activity. Essentially, it's when an organism stops doing what it needs to do to stay alive. Psychology, on the other hand, obviously doesn't offer a definition of death itself, but explores how we deal with its inevitability, such as through terror management theory. This theory suggests that we ease our fear of dying by creating cultures and self-esteem that gives us a sense of lasting significance. In philosophical terms, death can be seen as the moment when the fundamental activities that keep us alive come to a permanent stop. This includes everything that our bodies and minds do to keep us going, from basic things like breathing and our hearts beating, to more complex actions and thoughts that make us who we are. Death is a profound change, moving from a state of being alive, full of activity and growth, to a complete and irreversible halt of these life processes. It's not just about our body stopping, it's also about crossing a deep, philosophical line from existence to non-existence. In this way, death highlights the transition from being creatures with unique thoughts and experiences to no longer having that capacity or agency, which kind of really makes us us. Now, knowing death is inevitable, including for people around you, especially as you grow older, how can we really confront it? To do this, we should go back in time, to a place where some of the popular names you've heard, and that's none other than the period where the minds of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and Epicurus lived and roamed. In one dialogue from Plato, entitled Phaedo, he reiterated Socrates' philosophy of death. Quote, "The true philosophers are ever studying death. To them, of all men, death is the least terrible." End quote. Since philosophy's inception, death has been its core driving force, prompting us to set goals, value loved ones, and contemplate our life's end and how we face it. For Socrates and Plato, the purpose of philosophy is obvious. It's preparation for death. Plato extends this notion by linking it to a potential afterlife, a concept that Epicurus did not agree with. For the purpose of this video, I will be assuming death is really the end of it all, the final line to a book with no sequel, since death on a conceptual level is not as terrifying for a person who lives a good life and believes in an afterlife. But of course, this isn't as black and white. And for the sake of this video not being hours long, I want to focus on two contrasting views of the hundreds out there, and that being Thomas Nagel's and Epicurus' perspective on death. Born 7 years after Plato's passing, Epicurus was born and known as quite the rebellion, with revolting against his own teachers. In the great city of Athens, Epicurus strayed away from Plato's views on life and formed his own naturalistic view of the world. One of the most notable contributions he made was proposing that the world was made up of atoms over 2,000 years before they were even shown to exist. He rejected Plato's claims about the afterlife, believing that the soul dies with the body. He also encouraged a form of pleasurable living that was rejected by the Stoics, who thought that his way of life was degenerate. Epicurus proposed that pleasure, defined as the lack of pain and mental disturbance, was the goal of life, which is later echoed by the minds of major utilitarian philosophers, such as Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sedgwick. Epicurus believed to achieve that goal we needed to get rid of ourselves of fear, especially the fear of death. He believed that our fear of death is the worst fear we face in life because it pervades our thoughts while we are alive. According to Epicurus, our fear of death stops us from living. To live properly and happily, we must rid ourselves of the fear of death. But how do we do that? Epicurus' argument can be broken down into a deductive syllogism. 1. Things are only bad for us if they are experientially unpleasant. 2. The dead have no experience. 3. Therefore, by 1 and 2, nothing can be bad for the dead. 4. It is irrational to fear what will not be bad. 5. Therefore, by 3 and 4, it is irrational to fear death itself. For Epicurus' argument to be persuasive, you would need to accept at least 2 assumptions in his view, namely, 1. That death is the end of consciousness and that consciousness does not transcend the body. 2. You cannot be harmed by things you cannot experience. If you accept both assumptions, you probably will agree with Epicurus that it is irrational to fear death. If you disagree with the first assumption, if you believe in the life of the soul after death for example, you may find yourself seeking answers within theology about whether death should be feared or not. Things become interesting if you dispute the second assumption, and this is where we can ask, can we be harmed by things we cannot experience? Picture yourself at a housewarming party, chatting and laughing with the host, but little do you know your friend who you brought along is in the kitchen gossiping behind your back to anyone who'll listen. They are spinning tales about your past screw-ups, making you out to be the office joke. So while you're enjoying the party, your reputation is taking a hit behind your back, and unfortunately, you will never find out. So the question here is, have you been harmed? Pause the video and take a second and think about it. Thomas Nagel, a modern-day philosopher, has an interesting take on whether something bad happening without you knowing about it still counts as harm. He says yes, it does, but most likely not for the immediate reasons that pop up in our minds. Imagine your partner cheats on you, but you never find out. Nagel would argue that you've still been hurt by it. It's kind of like asking the classical personal identity question, what makes you you? If you're all about what's happening right here, right now, and what you can feel and think in the moment, then you might not buy into Nagel's idea, similar to Epicurus' way of thinking. On the other hand, as cringe as this sounds, if you see yourself as the main character in your own ongoing story with all its twists, turns, and unseen chapters, then Nagel's argument might hit closer to home. According to him, the quote-unquote you are this entire narrative, including the parts that you're not aware of. So in this bigger picture, something happening behind the scenes still affects your story, and in turn, you. And as a quick footnote, it's important to recognize that Nagel's argument has plenty of objections to it, just like every single philosophical argument, even Epicurus's. So Nagel's argument has plenty of objections like epistemic limitation, where it's difficult to ascertain harm when there is no awareness of it. So some may argue that harm is inherently tied to subjective experience. Also, harm typically involves a causal relationship between actions and their consequences. Additionally, Nagel's perspective blurs the boundaries of temporal identity and personal narrative. Nonetheless, I digress, and now you must be wondering, so how the hell does this apply to death really? That is because for Nagel, death is a harm, because it deprives us of more life, which he believes is intrinsically good. He states in his book, Mortal Questions, in a chapter titled Death, that, quote, all of us, I believe, are fortunate to have been born, end quote. It is from this conviction about the value of life that he builds his argument for why death is a harm. Quote, if we are to make sense of the view that to die is bad, it must be on the ground that life is a good and death is the corresponding deprivation or loss of that good, end quote. Nagel, unlike Epicurus, thinks that we are harmed by death because, quote, the time after his death is time of which his death deprives him, end quote. In other words, death deprives us of more life. It is for this reason that we step away from oncoming traffic and for why we mourn the death of a young person more intensely than that of an elderly person. However, the implications of Nagel's deprivation view are endless. How can we psychologically deal with our own impending death? Should we seek out immortality? Nagel's philosophy of death, for better or for worse, puts the fear back into death. One's answer to the question, is it rational to fear death, will determine a large part of their philosophy of death. To begin, we can ask which view is more reasonable, Nagel's or Epicurus's. Nagel's perspective helps us to understand our feelings and actions toward death, suggesting that they have a rational basis. On the contrary, Epicurus argues that our common reactions to death might not be logical. This invites us to scrutinize whether life's inherent value, as Nagel proposes, or our fear of death, or perhaps the consequences surrounding it, drives our anxieties, challenging Epicurus' stance. It's possible that the truth blends these views, prompting us to consider if we can dislike death without fearing it, and if there's a way to embrace the idea of death that enriches our lives. Ultimately, crafting a personal philosophy of death is a journey each of us undertakes to navigate these complexities. Other various perspectives on death, such as Socrates' view of life as akin to punishment or illness, with death serving as a welcome release, parallel the Buddha's belief in life as a realm of suffering and the ultimate liberation through death as the greatest good. Stoic philosophers ranging from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius encouraged embracing and even loving death as an integral part of the universe's unyielding natural laws. The 16th century philosopher Montaigne, inspired by Plato and Stoicism, equated philosophical enlightenment with the acceptance of death, epitomized in his essay, "To study philosophy is to learn how to die." But this now raises a question of regardless of the rationality of dying and the fear surrounding it, it will eventually happen to not just us, but our loved ones and the profound grief that comes with it. To examine this, we can explore art and cinema. It's not alarming to say death typically comes at surprise. In certain cases, it's incredibly tragic the way people die. One of the most notable and arguably most heartbreaking examples within the world of cinema is Manchester by the Sea. The film delves deeply into the grief experienced by its main character, Lee Chandler, particularly focusing on the aftermath of a personal tragedy that defines his life. The central event which transpires in Lee's life is the accidental death of his children in a fire, which is a tragedy for which he blames himself. While he was out late at night, the house furnace malfunctioned, causing a fire to break out where his children were sleeping. This malfunction, rather than any direct action or negligence on Lee's part, led to the fatal fire that resulted in the death of his children. Despite this, Lee carries the burden of guilt and blame for not being there to prevent the tragedy, and this incident is the core of the film's exploration of grief and its lasting impact, a true tragedy in every conceivable way. The film couldn't more accurately portray a certain manifestation of grief as a complex and multifaceted emotion that is not easily resolved or diminished, since the death of others is nothing easy, especially your own children. Instead of moving through the stages of grief toward recovery, Lee becomes mired in his sorrow and guilt, which profoundly affects his ability to engage with life and those around him. His grief is portrayed as a constant, almost character-defining presence, shaping every aspect of his behavior and interactions, a performance that undeniably earned Casey Affleck that Oscar.
Why can't you stay? Come on, Patty. I can't beat it. I can't beat it. I'm sorry.
Lee's handling of the tragedy is characterized by a self-imposed isolation and a refusal to allow himself happiness or closure. Since he believes he is directly responsible for his children's death, which leads him to a state of self-punishment, a solitary and joyless state of existence, and his reluctance to form close bonds or accept the possibility of even moving past the tragedy. The film does not offer easy answers or depict a journey towards healing. Instead, it presents grief as an enduring state, suggesting that some losses are so profound they permanently alter one's life. Lee's story is a portrayal of living with grief rather than overcoming it, highlights whether we like it or not, the reality that some tragedies are so devastating they cannot even be fully reconciled or quote-unquote beaten. Even though cases like Lee's are quite extreme tragedies, inevitably all of us will experience or have already experienced the loss of a cherished person, prompting us to examine our reactions in the face of death, where psychology can be profoundly helpful. Grief and loss are inexorably linked, weaving a complex tapestry of emotions that touch each of us in deeply personal ways. Yet, despite the unique manifestations of grief in our lives, there exists a universal thread that connects these experiences. It's a roller coaster of emotions, a journey with highs and lows, moments of peace interspersed with waves of acute pain. Understanding this, how do we even navigate the tumultuous waters of grief in a healthy manner? Ironically, discussing death and grieving in this video essay can be seen as a form of premeditation, a step in preparing for the inevitable losses that we will all face. By confronting these subjects now, we're engaging in a process that might help us, and perhaps others, cope better when the time comes. Grief in its essence is a testament to love. It's the price we pay for having the courage to form deep connections with others, knowing well the risk of eventual loss. First, it's crucial to acknowledge that grief is both a universal and a uniquely individual experience. While we all face loss, the way we process, experience, and move through grief varies widely among individuals. This variability is influenced by our relationships, cultural backgrounds, personal beliefs, and even our past experiences with loss. There's a perfect scene that encapsulates this in the show The Midnight Gospel.
No, I know this transfigure. I know, but come on. There's no way to stop the heartbreak. What do you do about that?
You cry. You cry.
This exchange is a poignant reminder of the raw, unfiltered reality of grief. It underscores a fundamental truth. Grief and heartbreak are inevitable aspects of the human experience, and suppression does not ease the pain. Instead, it's through the simple act of crying, of allowing ourselves to fully experience and express our sorrow, that we begin the journey of healing. The simplicity and honesty of this advice, funny enough, cuts through the complexities often surrounding discussions of grief. It doesn't offer a quote-unquote solution or a way to avoid pain, but rather affirms that feeling deeply is both necessary and inevitable. It beautifully illustrates that grieving is not a process to be fixed, but a human experience to be lived through, something we should welcome with open arms. Grief is not a linear process as well. It resembles a roller coaster more than a straight path. There will be moments when one thinks that they have moved past the deepest sorrows, only to find themselves plunged back into the abyss of agony. This is a normal part of grieving. Precisely acknowledging this non-linear progression is crucial in allowing yourself the patience and grace to heal at your own pace. I want to also importantly note that viewing this exploration of death and grieving as a form of premeditation is not about a morbid fascination, but about preparation and acceptance. It's about acknowledging the shared human experience of loss and the mixed emotion it brings. In discussing grief openly, we not only destigmatize it but also equip ourselves and others with the understanding and tools needed to face it with dignity when the time comes. Beyond mere reflection, which this whole video has been so far, let's get into the praxis, something actionable. The exploration of death brings us to a realization that the awareness of death is not a shadow that dims the light of life, but rather a beacon guiding us towards living more fully, meaningfully, and compassionately. Arguably one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time, Terry Pratchett once claimed, quote, "It is said that your life flashes before your eyes, just before you die. That is true. It's called life." End quote. This quote invites us all to ponder not just on death, but the actual fruitful part that precedes it, which is none other than our life. If death is indeed the culmination of life, then every moment leading up to it is a page in our narrative that ought to be written in depth with substance and stylistically in beauty. In this light, the urgency of living with purpose transcends mere contemplation, forcing us towards actionable steps. Eastern philosophy alongside Stoicism doesn't stop stressing the importance of accepting what we cannot control, pushing us to focus instead on where true power lies, within us. This realization marks the beginning of true wisdom and the foundation of a meaningful and a beautiful life. Central to both Eastern philosophies and Stoicism is the understanding that the external world is unpredictable and often beyond our control. Storms will rage, money will come and go, and the actions of others will sometimes bewilder or disappoint us. Attempting to exert control over these external events is like trying to grasp the wind, futile and exhausting. Instead, these philosophical traditions broadly teach that the essence of personal power and freedom comes from within, our responses, our attitudes, and our perspectives. It's vital to bring the locus of control back within you. By recognizing the limits of our external control and refocusing our energy on our internal state, we can find a profound sense of peace and empowerment. But now, how do we prepare ourselves emotionally for the inevitable losses that life entails? Through reflective practices like journaling and meditation, we cultivate a space for introspection and acceptance. By developing a robust support system, we ensure that we do not just face grief alone. And in cherishing and maximizing time with loved ones, we learn to live in the richness of the moment, undeterred by the specter of loss. Navigating anticipatory grief then becomes a process of acknowledging our fears and sorrows, seeking support, and practicing self-care. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit, capable of experiencing profound love and profound grief, often simultaneously. As we confront the inevitability of our own mortality and the mortality of those we love, we are confronted with a tough choice: to live in the shadow of death or to allow the knowledge of our finiteness to illuminate our path. Terry Eagleton, in the book The Meaning of Life, encapsulates this beautifully. Quote, "It is only because we carry death in our bones that we are able to keep on living." End quote. This paradox lies at the heart of this video's exploration. It is in embracing the certainty of death that we find the courage to live with authenticity, purpose, and gratitude.